There's not another animal in nature that would say, danger over there, I'll go over there, except for the predators. And so if you can think about this in the context of animals, you cannot imagine an antelope in Africa that sees the lion or hears the breaking twigs in the brush in the night and turns with fear and then says, oh, it's probably nothing. The dogs do not have things like judgment or wishes or opinions or denial. The dog never says, I wish this would be different, this situation I'm in. The dog never says, it shouldn't be this way, or it didn't used to be this way, or I won't accept it. The dog, like every animal, apprises the thing, sees it, takes it on board, and reacts. And they see things only as they are. What we do is cross-examine our own impulses. We get an intuitive impulse that you don't trust me for some reason. And then you say, well, hey, he's just come to the college, he's doing a nice thing, why wouldn't I trust him? And you go through this whole process of cross-examining your own feelings as opposed to just listening. And it's not that intuition will always be right, because your interpretation of it may not be right, but it will always have your best interest at heart. But human beings do that every day, right? We undermine our own intuitive signal.
Have an ability to face unpleasant facts. Is that what you've demonstrated in 1984 by drawing an accurate portrait of the future?
I think that allowing for the book being, after all, a parody, something like 1984 could actually happen.
No villain is safe from me, serpent.
I'm not a villain, I'm a transvestite.
Explain that to your maker.
I'll take it from here, Bartman.
The Times says the project aims to reframe American history.
It is an examination of the United States' origin story, a corrective history. It is designed to kickstart conversations, thus that hashtag I just mentioned, 1619 Project Brunch. Now to some major news out of the NFL. A source telling ESPN that Washington's NFL team retiring its controversial nickname.
The Aunt Jemima brand is getting erased. The name and logo are being dropped from all products, including the iconic pancake mix and maple syrup. Within hours of the Aunt Jemima announcement came word that Uncle Ben's Rice would get a new brand identity.
Tonight, the Phoenix City Council voted to change the name of streets that they find offensive.
Barnes & Noble is facing backlash over its diverse editions of classic novels. Some to mention, like Peter Pan, The Secret Garden, are being displayed with new covers. The characters on the books are being reimagined as different ethnicities. Twitter dropping the programming terms master, slave, and blacklist from its code. Master and slave are going to become leader and follower.
This is from 2020. Twitter engineers replacing racially loaded tech terms like master and slave. The site's move toward inclusive language formally began in January, months before the current Black Lives Matter protests. No one expects that changing technical terms will end centuries of racial injustice, but some people at technology companies, including Oliver and Augustine at Twitter, are pressing for the changes that are within their reach. That includes the effort to replace racially fraught technology terms like master and slave. Accelerated by Black Lives Matter. Such efforts have taken on new importance with the new push against racial equality in the United States triggered by the death of George Floyd, a 46-year-old Minnesota man killed in May by a policeman pinned him to the ground with a knee on his neck. The event triggered Black Lives Matter protests around the country.
Heckled. She was talking about, other issues, I think finance, and she was heckled by someone in the crowd, a few people in the crowd, Black Lives Matter protesters.
Exactly.
And this was her response to them.
Victim mentality is not cool. I don't know why people like being oppressed. It's the weirdest thing I've ever heard. I love oppression. We're oppressed. 400 years of slavery, Jim Crow, which, by the way, none of you guys lived through. Your grandparents did, and it's embarrassing that you utilize their history. You're not living through anything right now. You're overly privileged American.
Well, her comments at UCLA went viral, and out of nowhere, who saw this coming? Kanye West tweeted this out. I love the way Candace Owens thinks. Then suddenly, he has been taking heat from the political left about that. We had Candace Owens on over the weekend, and she had this observation about what's going on regarding, first, her comments about Black Lives Matter, and then Kanye West jumping on the bandwagon.
There is no value in being a victim. There is no value in being oppressed. There is only value in looking forward toward the future. And that is what I preach and what I practice every single day and what I'm trying to wake up the Black community to understand. For too long, we have been used by pawns, and Black Lives Matter is an example of that. They are pawns to the Democratic Party that go out and ruin their lives for something that they don't even understand and which is fundamentally false.
Mm-hmm.
The new Black Lives Matter energy boosted the vocabulary change at Twitter. Everything that's happened recently has made awareness spread blisteringly fast around the company.
We're not shaming anybody, God. We're just humbling ourselves before you. Yes, Lord. You brought the thunder and rain today, God. Because Satan takes the L today. Father, in Jesus' name, you get the victory. Father, we ask for forgiveness from our Black brothers and sisters for years and years of racism, of systematic racism.
We're really allowed to notice what's happening in Seattle or any of our big cities which are collapsing. And people like Robin DiAngelo are charged with making you not notice. According to Robin DiAngelo, America's biggest problem has nothing to do with economics. It's not crime or unemployment. It's not the mismanagement of the people in charge. The problem with Americans is their DNA. Now, a sane society would reject that for what it is, open racism. But Robin DiAngelo has gotten richer and more famous. She's all over television saying the same thing. Your skin color determines whether or not you're a good person.
I'll never forget asking a group, okay, so what if you could just give us feedback on our inevitable and often unaware racist assumptions and behaviors? And I'll never forget this Black man raising his hand and saying, it would be revolutionary.
Know what the word revolution means. It's a communist word. Inspired by the ideas of Marxism that aims to replace capitalism with communism.
And just take that in. I just want all the white people to just take that in. Revolutionary, that we would receive the feedback with grace, reflect, and seek to change our behavior. That's how difficult we are.
Wow.
That's how big a-holes we are.
Yeah.
That was last year, by the way. Robin DiAngelo, though, has not gone away. Now she's delivering video lectures as part of something called the LinkedIn Learning Series. And if LinkedIn is behind it, it's everywhere. Several major corporations direct employees to the learning platform, which is owned by Microsoft. In one of her lunatic presentations, DiAngelo notes that, quote, to be less white is to be less oppressive, less arrogant, less defensive, and more humble. You're seeing that slide on your screen. The presentation goes on to urge employees to, quote, try to be less white. Again, many corporations are using LinkedIn for training, including Coca-Cola, which is run, you won't be surprised to know, by a white guy. J.D. Vance is the author of Hillbilly Elegy. He joins us tonight. J.D., I have to wonder what effect this kind of stuff is having on our society.
Well, first of all, Tucker, I think it's ridiculous, and frankly, it's destroying our society. So, I think about my own family, Tucker. One of the great things that's happened to me, I think the greatest thing in my life, is that I married a woman who wasn't the same skin color as me, and I was able to do that because I grew up in a country that taught us not to think about each other as members of a racial group. We were taught to think about each other as people. And what these people are doing by constantly forcing us to focus on the color of our skin is they're destroying an essential part of American heritage, that we can judge people based on the content of their character. They're doing it, I think, for cynical reasons, but at the end of the day, they're going to destroy something that's critical and important and good about this country, and we should fight back against it.
This was removed in the end.
I feel that the Democrat Party represents Black America like plantation owners represented slaves. And the irony here being is that the Democrats were the slave owners.
Candace Owens says, I've never met a single Black American who was a slave, or a single white American who was a slave owner. Owens tweeted that human parasites come in every race. Maybe I live in a box, but I've never met a single Black American who was a slave, or a single white American who was a slave owner. I've only come across lazy people who believe that those of us who work ought to support them. Human parasites, and they come in every race. Why are we penalizing people for what their ancestors did? Herschel Walker says, if we look back far enough, each of us, no matter our race, would find something wrong in our predecessor's life. What's important is how we live our lives today. The Reverend Franklin Graham retweeted Walker's post, adding that when we stand before God, we will be accountable, blah blah.
Let's watch this.
I have never discriminated on the basis of sexual preference.
Sexual preference is an offensive and outdated term.
So Merriam-Webster, the dictionary, here's the old definition versus the new definition of sexual preference. Before it said orientation, sense, sexual preference. And now, after that exchange between the two of them on Tuesday, now it says offensive, sense, sexual preference. What's your response?
You stupid dinosaur! Get the out of here! I'm sorry, you guys.
That is a child attacking her mother and father for the crime of insufficient loyalty to Black Lives Matter. Here's a 15-year-old from Louisiana called Isabella. There are many like her in America right now.
I literally hate my family so much. It's just, they just try to argue with me that George Floyd they're just trying to tell me that like he deserved that because he did something wrong and that it was okay. That is not okay. And it's just making me so upset. I don't know why. I do not want to live here. I hate living in Louisiana. I hate living around these racist.
Think Trump is worse than Hitler?
Yes.
Yeah,
definitely. Yeah. Why do you say that?
He's childish.
Yeah.
That's all I gotta say.
He's trying to solve, like food stamps. People need those.
Do you think that ending food stamps is as bad as killing like 6 million Jews?
He did that?
Yeah.
Gee.
He killed
That's why
Jews. He's trying to just destroy the planet.
And built that wall, yeah.
They did a Harvard study and actually a judicial system study as well, and they found that there was no racial bias when it came to police shootings last year. When you guys hear that, what does that make you think?
Cap.
That's it. Cap. They did a study that showed that cops are actually 18 times more likely to be killed than an unarmed black man is to be killed by the police. Cap.
Yeah, that is cap.
Let's do it. Do you think the gender wage gap is real?
I do.
How do you stop the gender wage gap?
That's a great question. I think we have to take a look at our government and our understanding of capitalism and consumerism and kind of start working there and work backwards.
If you had like a business, you know what I mean, and they could pay women 77 cents for every dollar that a man would make, that would be like capitalism. So they would hire all women.
I suppose in a sense I'm following what you're saying, but...
You can protest all you want, but the I just saw take place. I know there are people out here, homeless people, who rely on those banks to charge their phone.
But in today's culture, just a simple social media post from years ago can prevent you from getting a job. Is that fair?
Tonight, Denver 7's Russell Haythorne goes 360 on the rise of what's being referred to as cancel culture.
You may have never heard the term cancel culture.
It's somewhat of a boycott of a person who has done something that other people find objectionable.
It can also be someone just like you and me.
Putting something out there that can probably offend somebody.
So I often caution people, especially young people, students, about what they place on social media because that is their professional image and picture forever.
Cancel culture is a form of boycott or public shaming of a person who has shared a questionable or unpopular opinion.
This is the direction the world is going in at the present time. In our world, there will be no emotions except fear, rage, triumph, and self-abasement. The sex instinct will be eradicated. We shall abolish the orgasm. There will be no loyalty except loyalty to the party. But always there will be the intoxication of power. Always, at every moment, there will be the thrill of victory, the sensation of trampling on an enemy who is helpless. If you want a picture of the future, imagine a boot stamping on a human face forever.
I'd like to share a revelation that I've had during my time here. It came to me when I tried to classify your species. I realized that you're not actually mammals. Every mammal on this planet instinctively develops a natural equilibrium with the surrounding environment, but you humans do not. You move to an area and you multiply, and multiply until every natural resource is consumed. And the only way you can survive is to spread to another area. There is another organism on this planet that follows the same pattern. Do you know what it is? A virus. Human beings are a disease, a cancer of this planet. You are a plague.
You built these weapons to destroy us because you are afraid of our gifts. Because we are different. Humanity has always feared that which is different. Well, I'm here to tell you, to tell the world, you're right to fear us. We are the future. We are the ones who will inherit this earth.
Is hope in global cooperation.
We are seeing progress in the sense that in the last 4 months, a global group has come together called the Act A Accelerator. They're working on behalf of the world on a vaccine, on therapeutics, on diagnostics, and on getting PPE out there everywhere it needs to go.
Democracy is at risk in many parts of the world. Autocracy is back in vogue. unprecedented wealth is accumulating in ever fewer hands. Trillions have gone missing offshore. Even in mature democracies, the restraint on power is often alarmingly feeble. Society is going wrong and gives us a chance to put things right. It scrutinizes power and identifies those who are serving the people and those who are serving themselves. It holds those in authority to higher standards. It keeps tabs on the use and abuse of technology, which must exist in service of people and not the other way round. It highlights the unfairness and inequality of the world and demands redress.
China, of course, has always said that Taiwan should be taken by force if necessary. A clueless Joe Biden, meanwhile, was asked about the issue overnight, referring to an agreement that actually doesn't exist.
I've spoken with Xi about Taiwan. We agree we'll abide by the Taiwan agreement. That's where we are. And we made it clear that I don't think he should be doing anything other than abiding by the agreement.
The assumption is that Biden was talking about the one China policy. I don't know. Hopefully Xi Jinping knew what Biden was talking about, but who knows?
We've got to take it seriously because Xi does want to unify Taiwan with the mainland while he's the leader. He's a man in a hurry, and his only way to unify Taiwan now after what he's done to Hong Kong is to do it by force.
China's social credit system. Now, a lot of people either try to make excuses for it, or they try to talk about how bad it actually is. I'm here to tell you that it's probably not what you think, but it in fact is probably much worse than you think. Everyone likes to make this comparison of China's social credit system to the episode of Black Mirror, where the woman is basically in a dystopian future where everyone has this app and they're basically rated on their popularity, whether people like them, and they're rated out of 5 stars and they're segregated as such. So, for example, car rental companies won't rent to people below a certain score, people will judge you for being below a certain threshold, not invite you to events, companies might reject you from jobs. But anyway, all of this is based on the ability of everybody else being able to rate each other. So it's not really the same as China's social credit system in that in China, nobody is rating each other. Another misconception I'd like to get out of the way first is comparing it to the credit system, the credit score system of the US. So think of things like FICO. Most of you are probably familiar with a financial credit score that rates your financial trustworthiness. It's intended to give creditors an indication of risk and how likely you are to repay your loan commitments. However, outside of transactions, a bad credit score does not prevent you from seeing your family or enrolling your kids in public school. In China, an individual's finances, social media activities, credit history, health records, online purchases, tax payments, legal matters, and people you associate with, in addition to images gathered from China's 200 million surveillance cameras and facial recognition software. By the way, do the math. That is 1 surveillance camera for every 7 citizens.
Here is 2084. A Chinese citizen with an authentic Chinese name, Winston Smith, has decided to venture from his apartment to a seedier part of the city. But he isn't looking for a typical dark alley product or service. No, he's purchasing a forbidden blank paper book, a journal to write down his true thoughts on his life and on the party. He's going to commit thought crime against the state on the privacy of a page. Many of you may have recognized this as a reference to George Orwell's 1984, when the main character Winston Smith goes and buys a book to write in, and begins his journey of questioning society, away from the spying telescreens of the state, away from the stare of Big Brother. Fortunately for that Winston Smith in 1984, he doesn't live in a world of digital surveillance. And unfortunately for our Winston Smith, in the year 2084, as soon as he searched for blank books on China's largest shopping site, Alibaba, the system flagged him. The same happened when he searched China's largest search engine, Baidu, for nearby bookstores. His phone tracked his GPS movements on his way to the store, and the state made note of the bank transaction when he finally purchased the book. So he's immediately arrested and taken to prison room 101 for re-education. The point is that even George Orwell only imagined a world where your TV spied on you, not our world of all-encompassing digital surveillance. Okay, so that was an over-exaggerated example. Let's look at something that actually happens today. You're in China and you've been working without a day off for the past few months and decide you want to take a vacation. You go to an airline's website, enter your personal and financial details, you've been approved a few days off work, your credit card is paid off, and you're looking forward to visiting friends in another city. But when you hit the purchase button, the online system rejects you, referring to the Supreme Court as the reason why you are unable to purchase a ticket. Evidently, you're blacklisted. Now this scenario has actually happened in China. 23 million people have been barred from purchasing domestic flights due to their low social credit scores, according to government statistics. Now, what is social credit? What distinguishes social credit from, say, just a credit score like we're accustomed to in the West? In the West, a credit score, at its most basic, is a number representing how worthy you are of a loan, how much debt you can take on and pay off. It's financial. Social credit includes the financial stuff, but also much more than that. Imagine if your credit score was also affected by the people you chose to associate with, your political affiliation, how many kids you had, how many hours a day you gamed or browsed social media, your volunteer work, or lack thereof, your faith, all your spending habits, all your day-to-day behaviors, amalgamated into a single number that not just some company can see, not just the government can see, but all your friends and family, all your nosy neighbors. Imagine the pressure and the consequences something like that could have.
China has long been a surveillance state. Now Big Brother meets Big Data. In trials across the country, cameras and spyware are watching, mapping your digital footprint to every step you take. What you do, say, and even think is being monitored and marked against you. The party calls it social credit, a personal scorecard for 1.4 billion citizens, rewards for good behaviour and punishments for bad, of China's dystopian future, the world's first digital dictatorship. China is positioning itself to lead the world in artificial intelligence. Surveillance technology is a key proving ground. Facial recognition, body scanning, and geo-tracking, matched with your personal data and online behavior, will power the social credit system.
一个人一旦有了芝麻信用，他的在生活当中的点点滴滴的信用行为都会被记录起来，用数字去衡量它。那一个人如果信用不好，我们实现的一个目标就是让守信者通行天下，让失信者寸步难行。
Sounds dramatic, but it's the party line. Pilot programs for a national social credit system are already underway. It will allow the trustworthy to roam freely under heaven, while making it hard for the discredited to take a single step.
And anyone who stands in our way will suffer the same fate as these men you see before. Let this be a warning to the world. And you tomorrow. That starts today.
We are the cure.
As the 21st century began, human evolution was at a turning point. Natural selection, the process by which the strongest, the smartest, the fastest reproduced in greater numbers than the rest, a process which had once favored the noblest traits of man, now began to favor different traits. Most science fiction of the day predicted a future that was more civilized and more intelligent. But as time went on, things seemed to be heading in the opposite direction, a dumbing down. How did this happen? Evolution does not necessarily reward intelligence. With no natural predators to thin the herd, it began to simply reward those who reproduced the most and left the intelligent to become an endangered species. And so it went for generations, although few, if any, seemed to notice. The years passed, and mankind became stupider at a frightening rate. Some had high hopes that genetic engineering would correct this trend in evolution. But sadly, the greatest minds and resources were focused on conquering hair loss and prolonging erections. Meanwhile, the population exploded and intelligence continued to decline until humanity was incapable of solving even its most basic problems, like garbage, which had been stacked for centuries with no plan whatsoever.
God's special creature? And I've warned him, Kevin. I've warned him every step of the way. Watching him bounce around like a fucking game, like a wind-up toy, like 250 pounds of self-serving greed on wheels. The next 1,000 years is right around the corner, Kevin. Eddie Barzoo, take a good look. Excuse me. Because he's the poster child for the next millennium. You sharpen the human appetite to the point where it can split atoms with its desire. You build egos the size of cathedrals, fiber optically connect the world to every eager impulse, grease even the dullest dreams with these dollar green, gold-plated fantasies until every human becomes an aspiring emperor, becomes his own god. And where can you go from there? We're scrambling from one deal to the next. Who's got his eye on the planet? As the air thickens, the water sours, even the bee's honey takes on the metallic taste of radioactivity. There is no future. Maybe it's true. Maybe God threw the dice once too often. Maybe he let us all down.
The death of the 2020 Joe Biden. In fact, Americans have suffered 100,000 additional deaths in the last 90 days, so no one's in control. And of course, the Democratic Party is imploding in Congress. I mean, we have an infrastructure bill which America needs. Roads and bridges are falling down, and so the progressives are prepared to blow up the whole thing. And Biden, he's lost control of it.
The moral to be drawn from this dangerous nightmare situation is a simple one. Don't let it happen. It depends on you.
George Orwell's writings have experienced a spike in popularity over the past decade, and for a simple reason. Modern societies are becoming ever more like the dystopia depicted in Orwell's most famous book, 1984. Whether it be mass surveillance, the incessant use of propaganda, perpetual war, or the cult of personality surrounding political leaders, it is not surprising that many see Orwell's novel as prescient in many ways. With that said, the West remains much freer than the dystopian society of 1984, but the trend does not bode well for those who favor a free society. Orwell, in fact, believed that totalitarianism of the type he satirized in his novel was a distinct possibility for the West, and at times he went as far as to suggest that it may in fact be inevitable. Almost certainly, he wrote in 1940, we are moving into an age of totalitarian dictatorships. In this video, we will look at what caused Orwell's pessimism, focusing on two trends in particular, the move toward collectivism and the rise of hedonism. Collectivism is a doctrine, or set of ideologies, in which the goals of a certain collective, such as a state, a nation, or a society, are given precedence over the goals of individuals. Socialism, communism, nationalism, and fascism are all collectivist ideologies. Orwell believed that a precondition for the rise of totalitarianism was the emergence of a collectivist social structure, as this permits the centralization of power needed to exert total societal control. Orwell's view of the connection between totalitarianism and collectivism has proved puzzling, as Orwell was a staunch leftist, a critic of capitalism, and a socialist. How could someone who favored socialism, a collectivist ideology, at the same time write a dystopian novel which portrays a collectivist society in such a horrific manner? To understand his position, it must first be realized that Orwell did not consider capitalism to be a viable system. It is not certain that socialism is in all ways superior to capitalism, he wrote, but it is certain that, unlike capitalism, it can solve the problems of production and consumption. Capitalism was such an inadequate system in Orwell's mind that, like many leftists of his day, he believed that it was on its deathbed and would soon be replaced by some form of collectivism. He saw this as inevitable. The issue for Orwell was what type of collectivism would take its place. The real question, he wrote, is whether capitalism, now obviously doomed, is to give way to oligarchy, totalitarianism, or to true democracy, democratic socialism. Following the impending death of capitalism, Orwell hoped that democratic socialism would be adopted in the West. Democratic socialists, like Orwell, advocated for a centrally planned economy, nationalization of all major industry, and a radical decrease in wealth inequality. They were also strong supporters of civil liberties such as freedom of speech and freedom of assembly, which they hoped could be maintained in a society which would largely deprive people of their economic freedoms. The problem, however, which Orwell and other socialists had to grapple with were the lack of examples, either past or present, of any countries successfully adopting democratic socialism. Even worse, the states that had turned to collectivism in the first half of the 20th century, such as Nazi Germany and Soviet Russia, were becoming increasingly totalitarian. They were adopting what Orwell called oligarchical collectivism, not democratic socialism. Oligarchical collectivism is a system in which an elite few, under the guise of a certain collectivist ideology, centralize power using force and deception. Once in power, these oligarchs crush not only the economic freedoms of their citizens, a move which socialists like Orwell favored, but also their civil liberties. Orwell was concerned that following the death of capitalism, the entire Western world would perhaps succumb to oligarchical collectivism. This fear was in part due to his perception that hedonism was on the rise in Western societies. Hedonism is an ethical position that maintains that life's ultimate goal should be the maximization of pleasure and the minimization of pain and discomfort. In an increasingly urban and consumerist West, Orwell believed that many people were structuring their lives in a hedonistic manner, and this did not bode well for the freedom of Western civilization. A hedonistic lifestyle, according to Orwell, weakens people. It makes them feeble and incapable of mounting any resistance to fanatical ideologues who desire to rule over society. This fear of Orwell's has proven unfounded up to this point. While the West, since his death in 1950, has in many respects become more hedonistic, this has not led to totalitarian dictators taking over control. Rather, Aldous Huxley, the author of another famous 20th century dystopian novel, Brave New World, may have had a better grasp of the way Western societies would become enslaved in the late 20th and early 21st centuries. Huxley, like Orwell, was an anti-hedonist, but his aversion to hedonism differed from Orwell's. Huxley's main concern was that hedonism could be used as an effective tool to oppress a society, because people will willingly forego freedom in exchange for sensory pleasure and endless consumption. If a society can be structured so that people can devote much of their time to pursuing pleasures, gratifying material wants, and even drugging themselves to escape from reality, then persuasion and conditioning, rather than physical coercion, will be sufficient to exert extreme control over a society. Neil Postman, in his book Amusing Ourselves to Death, nicely contrasts the differing fears of Orwell and Huxley. What Orwell feared were those who would ban books. What Huxley feared was that there would be no reason to ban a book, for there would be no one who wanted to read one. Orwell feared that the truth would be concealed from us. Huxley feared the truth would be drowned in a sea of irrelevance. Orwell feared we would become a captive culture. Huxley feared we would become a trivial culture. In 1984, people are controlled by inflicting pain. In Brave New World, they are controlled by inflicting pleasure. In short, Orwell feared that what we fear will ruin us. Huxley feared that what we desire will ruin us. The West, it seems, finds itself in a situation somewhat analogous to what Huxley feared. For like the proverbial frog in boiling water, Citizens in the West accept greater and greater intrusions into their freedoms and with little resistance. The overt physical coercion that Orwell thought would be required to enslave a society has so far proved unnecessary. Before dismissing Orwell's fears completely, however, it must be noted that Orwell was familiar with Huxley's position, and he did not deny that the hedonistic society Huxley feared was a possibility. But he saw it as a temporary stage, creating the ideal conditions for a more brutal regime to seize control and impose its will on society.
1958 book, Brave New World Revisited, Aldous Huxley wrote the following. If the first half of the 20th century was the era of the technical engineers, the second half may well be the era of the social engineers, and the 21st century, I suppose, will be the era of world controllers, the scientific caste system, and Brave New World. 30 years prior to penning these words, Huxley wrote his classic work of fiction, Brave New World. Set in the distant future, this book depicts a scientifically managed dystopian society. In Brave New World, the ruling authorities attain mass compliance not through force, but by supplying the masses with endless streams of distracting entertainment, and manipulating them with drugs and other technological methods. Huxley wrote Brave New World as a warning. Advances in science and technology, he believed, were paving the way for the type of society depicted in this book, and he cautioned that if a Brave New World type of order solidifies, it could be the final or ultimate revolution. The people will have their liberties taken from them, but they will enjoy their servitude and so never question it, let alone rebel. In a 1962 interview at Berkeley University, Huxley explained, "It seems to me that the nature of the ultimate revolution with which we are now faced is precisely this, that we are in the process of developing a whole series of techniques which will enable the controlling oligarchy, who have always existed and will always exist, to get people to love their servitude." According to Huxley, this Brave New World totalitarianism was most likely to solidify in the 21st century, and so in this video we are going to examine whether Huxley's predictions are coming true. Do we live in a brave new world? In Brave New World Revisited, Huxley wrote the following. In 1931, when Brave New World was being written, I was convinced that there was still plenty of time. The completely organized society, the scientific caste system, the abolition of free will by methodical conditioning, the servitude made acceptable by regular doses of chemically induced happiness. These were coming all right, but not in my time, not even in the time of my grandchildren. 27 years later, I feel a good deal less optimistic than I did when I was writing Brave New World. The prophecies made in 1931 are coming true much sooner than I thought they would. The nightmare of total organization has emerged from the safe, remote future, and is now awaiting us, just around the next corner. In Brave New World, advances in psychology made it possible for the ruling authorities to use mind control to condition citizens from an early age to think and behave in ways that were submissive and conformist. Nearly 100 years after Huxley wrote his dystopian novel, has this type of conditioning left the realm of fiction and entered reality? Today, the art of mind control is in the process of becoming a science, Huxley wrote in 1958. The practitioners of this science know what they are doing and why. They are guided in their work by theories and hypotheses solidly established on a massive foundation of experimental evidence. While the idea of mind control may sound like science fiction, in the mid to late 20th century, many prominent philosophers, psychologists, and scientists joined Huxley in sounding the alarm bell that research into the fundamentals of this phenomenon were well underway. In 1953, the distinguished British philosopher Bertrand Russell explained, "It is to be expected that advances in physiology and psychology will give governments much more control over individual mentality than they now have even in totalitarian countries." The renowned 20th century American clinical psychologist Carl Rogers warned that the rapid development of the behavioral sciences, which is a cluster of scientific disciplines including psychology, psychiatry, sociology, social psychology, anthropology and biology, economic and political science, mathematics and statistics, was in the process of becoming what he called an if-then science. By this he meant that scientists and social engineers were discovering that if carefully constructed conditions are implemented in a society, then there is a high probability that the majority of citizens will respond to these conditions in predictable and hence controllable ways.
In the early stages of World War II, now, Hitler and Stalin had signed a non-aggression pact. And Hitler invaded the Soviet Union anyway. And from what I've been able to understand, the Soviets had prepared an invasion force for Europe at that point, but were not concerned with having to defend their territory. And so they were caught completely unawares by Hitler's move. And the conditions on the Russian front were absolutely dreadful. And Solzhenitsyn was a soldier on the Russian front. He wrote some letters to one of his friends, which were intercepted, complaining about the lack of preparation and using bitter, dark humor to describe the situation. And the consequences of that was that he was thrown into a work camp. The Soviet system relied on work camps, and so those were large labor camps of people who were essentially enslaved, many of whom were worked to death at that point. That Stalin, who was an absolutely barbaric in every possible way you could imagine, was planning to start a third world war. And he was certainly capable of doing such things because he had already imprisoned or killed tens of millions of people. And the deaths of, well, Solzhenitsyn estimated the deaths in internal repression in the Soviet Union at something approximating 60 million between 1919 and 1959. Now, that doesn't count the death toll in the Second World War, by the way. He also estimated that the same kind of internal repression in Maoist China cost 100 million lives. The things that's really surprising to me and that I think is absolutely reprehensible, is the fact that this is not widespread knowledge among students in the West, any of this. And it's because your education, your historical education, if you started to describe it as appalling, you would barely scratch the surface. These were the most important events of the 20th century, and they're barely covered at all in standard historical curriculum. You know of something, I would presume, about World War II and about the terrible situation in Nazi Germany and the death of 6 million gypsies and Jews and homosexuals in the concentration camps in Nazi Germany. But my experience with students has been that none of them know anything about what happened as a consequence of the repression of the radical left in the 20th century. And I believe the reason for that is that the communist system had extensive networks of admirers in the West, especially among intellectuals, and still, in fact, does, which is also equally reprehensible. And I believe that one of the consequences of that is that this element of history has been under-examined, and certainly very little attention has been brought to it in the public school curricula. And there's absolutely no excuse for that. It was the worst thing that happened in the 20th century. And that's really saying something, because the 20th century was about as bad as it gets.
For non-conformity, the world whips you with its displeasure. This remark by Ralph Waldo Emerson makes it clear that the forces of conformity were quite strong when he lived nearly 200 years ago. However, he would likely be surprised at the extent to which the whipping of nonconformists has now been made possible with the emergence of social media and other mass communication technologies. No longer is conformity primarily enforced by members of one's community, but rather through online social networks, people from all over the world can ostracize, shame, and ridicule those who fail to hold beliefs or display behaviors which are considered socially acceptable. But this magnified ability to enforce conformity comes at a price, as it is the nonconformists who bring forth the new ideas, creations, and ways of living which produce a vibrant society. Furthermore, many who have reflected on the human condition have suggested that too much conformity deadens the human spirit, and that a fulfilling life is one which sees the flowering of one's uniqueness, not the mimicking of the crowd.
And so, and the fact that these deaths on massive scale occurred,
And the fact that we don't know that deep inside our bones is a testament to the absolute rot of the education system. So now, you might think this is a strange thing to discuss in a personality course, but I have my reasons for doing it. The fundamental reason is that Solzhenitsyn you might regard as an existentialist. Now, he says many of the same things that Viktor Frankl says. Viktor Frankl wrote a book called Man's Search for Meaning, which I would highly recommend. And it's a description of the corruption that he saw leading into the horrors of the Nazi concentration camp systems, especially within the concentration camps itself, because Frankl was very interested in what sort of psychological catastrophe had to befall a given individual before that person was capable of acting as an agent, say, of the Nazis in the concentration camp system. And he concentrated particularly on these people he called that were known as trustees within the concentration camp system, who were generally Jewish individuals who were aiding the Nazis in their death work inside the camps. Now, what Frankl did, because he was also existentially oriented, was attempt to draw a parallel between the individual psychology and the mass pathologies of the state. And so the reason that I believe that this is important in a personality class is because it's necessary to analyze the relationship between the psychological integrity of the individuals within a society and the propensity of that society to engage in, say, acts of mass atrocity, or to go completely off the rails and then to engage in acts of mass atrocity.
We are so susceptible to conformity. While conformity can be defined as the imitation of behaviors, beliefs, and values which are considered socially acceptable, non-conformity, for the purpose of this video, is not merely the rejection of the socially accepted. A person who rejects things just out of the desire to be different still conforms, as their life, like that of the more typical conformist, is still shaped by an external source, that being the crowd. True nonconformity, in contrast, is displayed to the degree that one's life path and thus character are shaped by behaviors, beliefs, and values which are chosen for personal or authentic reasons. In many cases, this will entail the adoption of things considered socially acceptable, but the nonconformist adopts them because they understand their utility, while the conformist adopts them merely out of the desire to be accepted. While there are numerous forces behind the tendency to conform, some have suggested that the fear of death is one of the most influential factors in this respect. By the time most of us reach adulthood, we have been inculcated to view our uniqueness not as something to be cultivated, but as something to be shunned. Very few people view themselves as capable of bringing forth anything of significance into the world, and so are incapable of engaging in personal heroism. For such people, an alternative route to the denial of death is required, or else they run the risk of being overwhelmed by anxiety and nihilistic despair. This alternative is found through conformity and the adoption of predetermined social roles, or what Becker calls cultural heroism. While this path limits the expression of one's uniqueness and leads to a life dominated by repetition and routine, it provides people with security and comfort, and makes them feel as if they are participating in something significant, or as Becker explains, like many prisoners, they are comfortable in their limited and protected routines, and the idea of a parole into the wild world of chance, accident, and choice terrifies them. In the prison of one's character, one can pretend and feel that he is somebody, that the world is manageable, that there is a reason for one's life, a ready justification for one's action. To live automatically and uncritically is to be assured of at least a minimum share of the programmed cultural heroics. Comfortable is largely a robotic state. Such people are always looking to others in order to determine how to behave and what to believe. Thus, in effect, conformity amounts to living one's life for others, not for oneself. And as Virginia Woolf recognized, once conform, once do what other people do because they do it, and a lethargy steals over all the finer nerves and faculties of the soul. One becomes all outer show and inward emptiness, dull, callous, and indifferent. This stultifying effect of conformity led Kierkegaard to stress the importance of striving to follow a life path which is personally chosen, as a conformist's existence can barely be called living at all. In his work concluding Unscientific Postscript to Philosophical Fragments, He suggests that cultivating one's uniqueness is like riding a wild stallion, while conforming is like falling asleep on a moving hay wagon. But like Becker, Kierkegaard realized that few people are capable of cultivating their uniqueness, for as he wrote, surrounded by hordes of people, busy with all sorts of secular matters, more and more shrewd about the ways of the world, such a person forgets himself, forgets his name divinely understood, does not dare to believe in himself, finds it too risky to be himself, far easier and safer to be like the others, to become a copy, a number, a part of the crowd.
And so it was Frankel's contention and also Solzhenitsyn's contention, and I would say also the contention of Václav Havel, who was an author and playwright in Czechoslovakia and eventually became president, that the fundamental linkage between the pathology and the state, the pathology of the state and the individual, was the individual's propensity to deceive him or herself and to fail to act in an authentic manner, become, as a consequence, either nihilistic, let's say, or because of the incremental weakening of character that's part and parcel of adopting an inauthentic mode of being, or to turn to ideological and totalitarian solutions as an alternative to living appropriately and with responsibility as an individual. So Solzhenitsyn in particular laid at the feet of the Soviet citizenry the burden of the absolute catastrophes that characterized that system because of each individual's propensity or proclivity within the state to lie and deceive constantly about what they thought and what they said, and to be afraid to speak and to be afraid to think and to be afraid to criticize. And it was no wonder, because criticism, of course, was at least became an offense that was punishable by death. But these things start much more slowly than that, and they start with people abandoning their own identities and adopting a pathological group identity, well, for any number of reasons, but one of them certainly is their desire to shrink from individual responsibility and their desire for ready-made ideological solutions.
The same stupid communist idea has been returning to us under a slightly different name, but in a new clothing.